Welcome to the Chronicles of Josephus Audio, bringing to life the Antiquities of the Jews, written by the ancient historian Flavius Josephus nearly 2,000 years ago. In this presentation, we begin Book 1, chapters 1 through 3, the first of many journeys through the history of the world. Take a moment to settle in and prepare to hear history as told by one who sought to preserve the very voice of creation itself. Book 1, containing the interval of 3,833 years, from the creation to the death of Isaac. Chapter 1, the constitution of the world and the disposition of the elements. 1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. But when the earth did not come into sight, but was covered with thick darkness, and a wind moved upon its surface, God commanded that there should be light. And when that was made, he considered the whole mass, and separated the light and the darkness. And the name he gave to one was night, and the other he called day. And he named the beginning of light, and the time of rest, the evening and the morning, summer. And this was indeed the first day. But Moses said it was one day, the cause of which I am able to give even now. But because I have promised to give such reasons for all things in a treatise by itself, I shall put off its exposition till that time. After this, on the second day, he placed the heaven over the whole world, and separated it from the other parts, and he determined it should stand by itself. He also placed a crystalline firmament round it, and put it together in a manner agreeable to the earth, and fitted it for giving moisture and rain, and for affording the advantage of dews. On the third day he appointed the dry land to appear, with the sea itself round about it. And on the very same day he made the plants and the seeds to spring out of the earth. On the fourth day he adorned the heaven with the sun, the moon, and the other stars, and appointed them their motions and courses, that the vicissitudes of the seasons might be clearly signified. And on the fifth day he produced the living creatures, both those that swim and those that fly, the former in the sea, the latter in the air. He also sorted them as to society and mixture, for procreation, and that their kinds might increase and multiply. On the sixth day he created the four-footed beasts, and made them male and female. On the same day he also formed man. Accordingly Moses says, that in just 6 days the world, and all that is therein, was made, and that the seventh day was a rest, and a release from the labor of such operations. Whence it is that we celebrate a rest from our labors on that day, and call it the Sabbath, which word denotes rest in the Hebrew tongue. 2. Moreover, Moses, after the seventh day was over, begins to talk philosophically, and concerning the formation of man says thus, that God took dust from the ground, and formed man, and inserted in him a spirit and a soul. This man was called Adam, which in the Hebrew tongue signifies one that is red, because he was formed out of red earth, compounded together, for of that kind is virgin and true earth. God also presented the living creatures, when he had made them, according to their kinds, both male and female, to Adam, who gave them those names by which they are still called. But when he saw that Adam had no female companion, no society, for there was no such created, and that he wondered at the other animals which were male and female, he laid him asleep, and took away one of his ribs, and out of it formed the woman, whereupon Adam knew her when she was brought to him, and acknowledged that she was made out of himself. Now a woman is called in the Hebrew tongue Isa, but the name of this woman was Eve, which signifies the mother of all living. 3. Moses says further that God planted a paradise in the east, flourishing with all sorts of trees, and that among them was the tree of life, and another of knowledge, whereby was to be known what was good and evil, and that when he brought Adam and his wife into this garden, he commanded them to take care of the plants. Now the garden was watered by one river which ran round about the whole earth, and was parted into 4 parts. And Physon, which denotes a multitude, running into India, makes its exit into the sea, and is by the Greeks called Ganges. Euphrates also, as well as Tigris, goes down into the Red Sea. Now the name Euphrates or Phrath denotes either a dispersion or a flower. By Tigris or Diglath is signified what is swift with narrowness, and Gihon runs through Egypt, and denotes what arises from the east, which the Greeks call Nile. God therefore commanded that Adam and his wife should eat of all the rest of the plants, but to abstain from the tree of knowledge, and foretold to them that if they touched it, it would prove their destruction. But while all the living creatures had one language, at that time the serpent, which then lived together with Adam and his wife, shewed an envious disposition at his supposal of their living happily, and in obedience to the commands of God, and imagining that when they disobeyed them, they would fall into calamities, he persuaded the woman, out of a malicious intention, to taste of the tree of knowledge, telling them that in that tree was the knowledge of good and evil, which knowledge, when they should obtain, they would lead a happy life, nay, a life not inferior to that of a god, by which means he overcame the woman, and persuaded her to despise the command of God. Now when she had tasted of that tree, and was pleased with its fruit, she persuaded Adam to make use of it also. Upon this they perceived that they were become naked to one another, and being ashamed thus to appear abroad, they invented somewhat to cover them, for the tree sharpened their understanding, and they covered themselves with fig leaves, and tying these before them, out of modesty, they thought they were happier than they were before, as they had discovered what they were in want of. But when God came into the garden, Adam, who was wont before to come and converse with him, being conscious of his wicked behavior, went out of the way. This behavior surprised God, and he asked what was the cause of this his procedure, and why he, that before delighted in that conversation, did now fly from it and avoid it. When he made no reply, as conscious to himself that he had transgressed the command of God, God said, I had before determined about you both how you might lead a happy life, without any affliction, and care and vexation of soul, and that all things which might contribute to your enjoyment and pleasure should grow up by my providence, of their own accord, without your own labor and painstaking, which state of labor and painstaking would soon bring on old age, and death would not be at any remote distance. But now thou hast abused this my good will, and hast disobeyed my commands, for thy silence is not the sign of thy virtue, but of thy evil conscience. However, Adam excused his sin, and entreated God not to be angry at him, and laid the blame of what was done upon his wife, and said that he was deceived by her, and thence became an offender, while she again accused the serpent. But God allotted him punishment, because he weakly submitted to the counsel of his wife, and said the ground should not henceforth yield its fruits of its own accord, but that when it should be harassed by their labor, it should bring forth some of its fruits, and refuse to bring forth others. He also made Eve liable to inconveniency of breeding, and the sharp pains of bringing forth children, and this because she persuaded Adam with the same arguments wherewith the serpent had persuaded her, and had thereby brought him into a calamitous condition. He also deprived the serpent of speech, out of indignation at his malicious disposition towards Adam. Besides this, he inserted poison under his tongue, and made him an enemy to men, and suggested to them that they should direct their strokes against his head, that being the place wherein lay his mischievous designs towards men, and it being easiest to take vengeance on him, that way. And when he had deprived him of the use of his feet, he made him to go rolling all along, and dragging himself upon the ground. And when God had appointed these penalties for them, he removed Adam and Eve out of the garden into another place. Book 1, Chapter 2, concerning the formation of man and the temptation of the woman. 1. Adam and Eve had 2 sons. The elder of them was named Cain, which name, when it is interpreted, signifies possession. The younger was Abel, which signifies sorrow. They had also daughters. Now the 2 brethren were pleased with different courses of life, for Abel the younger was a lover of righteousness, and believing that God was present at all his actions, he excelled in virtue, and his employment was that of a shepherd. But Cain was not only very wicked in other respects, but was wholly intent upon getting, and he first contrived to plow the ground. He slew his brother on the occasion following. They had resolved to sacrifice to God. Now Cain brought the fruits of the earth and of his husbandry, but Abel brought milk and the first fruits of his flocks. But God was more delighted with the latter oblation, when he was honored with what grew naturally of its own accord, than he was with what was the invention of a covetous man, and gotten by forcing the ground. Whence it was that Cain was very angry that Abel was preferred by God to himself, and he slew his brother, and hid his dead body, thinking to escape discovery. But God, knowing what had been done, came to Cain and asked him what was become of his brother, because he had not seen him of many days, whereas he used to observe them conversing together at other times. But Cain was in confusion, and denied that he knew his brother's whereabouts, but said he was not his brother's guardian or keeper. But God, convicting him as having been the murderer of his brother, said, I wonder at thy stupidity in imagining that thou canst hide thy crime from me. I am not ignorant of what thou hast done. For thou hast slain thy brother, and henceforth thou shalt lead a miserable life, for thou shalt be always trembling and shaking. And this, not only when anyone sees thee, but when thou art alone by thyself, and thou shalt suffer the punishment of thine impious act by thyself. God also made a mark upon Cain, that whosoever should meet him might know him, and slay him not, but let him live in perpetual banishment, that he might be a warning to mankind of how they ought to behave themselves to their brethren. After this Cain, though exceedingly disturbed at his punishment, went away from the presence of God. And, as he traveled over many countries, he, with his wife, built a city, named Nod, which is a place so called after him, and there he settled his abode, where he also had children. However, he did not accept of his punishment in order to amendment, but to increase his wickedness. For he only aimed to procure everything that was for his bodily pleasure, though it obliged him to be injurious to his neighbors. He augmented his household substance with much wealth by rapine and violence. He excited his acquaintance to procure pleasures and spoils by robbery, and became a great leader of men into wicked courses. He also introduced a change in that way of simplicity, wherein men lived before, and was the author of measures and weights. And whereas they lived innocently and generously while they knew nothing of such arts, he changed the world into cunning craftiness. He first of all set boundaries about lands. He built a city and fortified it with walls, and he compelled his family to come together to it, and called that city Enoch, after the name of his eldest son Enoch. Now Adam had 30 other sons and 30 daughters. But the posterity of Cain became exceedingly wicked, every one successively dying one after another more wicked than the former. They were intolerable in war, and vehement in robberies, and if anyone were slow to murder people, yet was he bold in his profligate behavior, in acting unjustly, and doing injury for gain. But God, exercising his benevolence toward men, made their virtue an occasion of their deliverance, and put an end to their wickedness by the destruction of that very generation, which was infected by the vices of Cain. But because Adam was very sorrowful at that wickedness of his son Cain, and was very uneasy at his death, he was not willing to have children for a long while after. But afterward he had one as a repairer of his loss, who was named Seth, which signifies that God granted him another son in the room of Abel, whom Cain slew. But Seth, being good, and of an excellent character, was himself imitated by his children, and they continued to esteem God as the Lord of the universe, and to have an entire regard to virtue for 7 generations. But in process of time they were perverted, and forsook the practices of their forefathers, and did neither pay those honors to God which were appointed them, nor had they any concern to do justice toward men. But for what degree of zeal they had formerly shown for virtue, they now showed by their actions a double degree of wickedness, whereby they made God to be their enemy. Book 1, Chapter 3, concerning the depravity of mankind before the deluge, and the deluge itself. Chapter 3. Now this posterity of Seth continued to esteem God as the Lord of the universe, and to have an entire regard to virtue for 7 generations. But in process of time they were perverted, and forsook the practices of their forefathers, and did neither pay those honors to God which were appointed them, nor had they any concern to do justice towards men. But for what degree of zeal they had formerly shown for virtue, they now showed by their actions a double degree of wickedness, whereby they made God to be their enemy. For many angels of God accompanied with women, and begat sons that proved unjust, and despisers of all that was good, on account of the confidence they had in their own strength. For the tradition is that these men did what resembled the acts of those whom the Grecians called jaw giants. But Noah was very uneasy at what they did, and being displeased at their conduct, persuaded them to change their dispositions and their acts for the better. But seeing they did not yield to him, but were slaves to their wicked pleasures, he was afraid they would kill him, together with his wife and children, and those they had married. So he departed out of that land. Now God loved this man for his righteousness, yet he not only condemned those other men for their wickedness, but determined to destroy the whole race of mankind, and to make another race that should be pure from wickedness. And cutting short their lives, and making their years not so many as they formerly lived, but 120 only, he turned his wrath to their destruction. They were indeed of the same height which they had before, nor did they lessen the stature of their bodies, but they were much inferior as to strength and the boldness of their attempts. For they were before notorious for their strength and the largeness of their bodies. Their faces also were terrible to behold, and they underwent great hardships, till they perished, both they and their virtues, for the sins they had been guilty of, nor could they escape the judgment of God. But Noah, being very uneasy at their actions, and seeing that they would not be persuaded to amend their ways, he left the country, and built an ark, after God had foretold to him that the world would be destroyed by water. This ark was made of a strong kind of wood, and was covered all over with bitumen, and had 3 stories, the height of each 30 cubits, but the length of it was 500 cubits, and the breadth 200 cubits. Now when Noah had entered into the ark, he and his wife and his sons and their wives, and all the creatures of all sorts, there came a great deluge of rain, the water pouring down in vast abundance, and it overflowed so greatly that it destroyed all those men who were not shut up in the ark, and it washed away the entire earth. But Noah alone was saved, for God took care of him on account of his righteousness. Now the ark rested on the top of a certain mountain in Armenia. It is said there remains the remains of this ark till this day, and that some part of this ship still remains, that they take off pieces of it, and make amulets for the averting of mischiefs. Now all the writers of barbarian histories make mention of this flood and of this ark. Among the Greeks, Berosus makes mention of it in his History of the Chaldeans, for when he has described the circumstances of the flood, he goes on thus: It is said there is still some part of this ship in Armenia, at the mountain of the Cordyaeans, and that some people carry off pieces of bitumen, which they take away, and use chiefly as amulets for the averting of mischiefs. Hieronymus the Egyptian also, who wrote the Phoenician Antiquities, and Nasias, and many more make mention of the same. Nay, Nicholas of Damascus, in his 96th book, has a particular relation about them, where he speaks thus: There is a great mountain in Armenia, over Minyas, called Baris, upon which it is reported that many who fled at the time of the deluge were saved, and that one who was carried in an ark came on shore upon the top of it, and that the remains of the timber were a great while preserved. This might be the man about whom Moses, the legislator of the Jews, wrote. You've been listening to the Chronicles of Josephus Audio, the Antiquities of the Jews, translated by William Whiston, first published in 1737. Today's reading covered Book 1, chapters 1 through 3, the story of creation, the formation of man, and the corruption that led to the great flood. Join us next time as we follow the calling of Abraham and the beginnings of God's covenant with his people. Follow and subscribe to the Chronicles of Josephus Audio on Spotify and YouTube, and continue this journey through the living history of our world.